Object and thought of the object. An object, any object, is physically rendered for us by our senses. Therefore, what we call physical is simply something rendered as a sense object. I see a person, I touch them, and I hear them. Then I call this person a physical object. That is, the senses give a physical object. If, on the other hand, we were to have no eyes, nor ears, no sense of touch and smell, that so-called physical object would vanish for us. This is the first point to understand, namely, what we mean by the term physical world, which our senses render for us and which we take as reality. If we lacked our 5 sense organs, or were immersed in a sensory deprivation tank, there would be no physical reality. A Sufi teacher points out to their students that whether a person takes pleasure in disliking the thing itself or in the thought of it, it is one and the same thing, and vice versa. This is about understanding the difference between disliking an object and disliking the thought of it. No difference can be discerned by most individuals. We are eating something with great relish and enjoying it as a physical object. When we are suddenly told it is a dish made from caterpillars, instantly we start to feel very sick. Here, obviously, the thought is different from the physical sensation. Our thinking is different from our senses, and on another plane, another level. You can see a person, or you can think about them. How you think about them is psychological and belongs to your inner psychological world. You can go on thinking about that person you dislike, quite apart from seeing them. When the Sufi teacher says that taking pleasure in disliking a thing and taking pleasure in the thought of it are the same thing, it means just what it says. Remember that a person is an object, and this work teaches a great deal about how we take pleasure in disliking certain things. The concept is subtle, because we imagine that we do not take pleasure in disliking people, and for this reason it is necessary to find for ourselves a real example of our disliking some physical object or person. If we dislike a person, i.e. an object, it gives great pleasure to hear that someone else dislikes them in the same way. This is pleasure in disliking, and this pleasure is reinforced through affirmation from others, which is common if we are honest with ourselves. The pleasure of disliking somebody or something is not the same as the pleasure we take in thinking about it. When a person, looking at another person as an object, transmitted through the senses, says, "Oh, how I hate someone like that," they take pleasure in disliking the object when it is before their eyes, and afterwards, if they think about that person, when they can no longer see them with their senses, they take pleasure in thinking how much they dislike them.
The Sufi teacher is pointing out exactly the same thing. They are taking pleasure in disliking the object when they see it, and taking pleasure in thinking about the object when they do not see it. Therefore, the effect is identical. In the one case, they are taking impressions of dislike from a visible object, and in the other, they are taking impressions from the thought of it. So in both of these cases, they are taking in negative impressions. Therefore, psychologically, it is the same thing in its effect. If someone wants to overcome their pleasure of disliking a person, they must also overcome their pleasure in thinking how they dislike that person. The work teaches that we must learn to handle one another rightly in the domain of our thoughts, in our psychological world, to which we have gradually to become more responsible. It is the reordering, the rearrangement of our psychological or inner life that is the objective of this work. It is how we think about others which is important in this work. If we take great pleasure in thinking evil of others, in thinking negatively, and attain a feeling of satisfaction from that, then our psychological world, from which starts the function of second and third bodies, is in a great muddle, and we run the risk of crystallizing out psychologically in quite the wrong manner. A person may for a long time not be able to overcome momentary dislike through their senses, but if they are working, they know they will have to get rid of thinking and feeling the same way internally.
realizing they cannot take pleasure in unpleasant thoughts about others, which is the great source of our inner life, such as it is. If our psychological world of thought and feeling could be arranged in better order, the way in which we think and feel about people in our seclusion, and if we could cease to take pleasure in hatred or negative criticism in general, our external relationship to one another as physical objects registered by our senses would alter completely. There are external reactions and more internal reactions. For a long time, we may react mechanically. In other words, we may react externally, and cannot change that. But if we have any insight or self-observation, then we would not necessarily let our internal side agree with our external side. Unless we see that we have an internal life of thought and feeling to which this work is directed, with the aim of building up a psychological body or organization rightly arranged, then we do not understand what work on self is all about. The objective of self-observation is to let a ray of light into our inner world, which lies in chaos. The purpose of this work is to then build this inner world of chaos into an ordered world. An ordinary human being behaves internally just as they please. They may be very polite externally. It does not occur to them that how they think or feel privately about other people matters. However, the work says it does matter. And so the journey begins with self-observation, whose object is to make us more conscious of what is going on in ourselves, in each center. After a time, we may reach that stage where we behave much better inside than we do outside. We cannot change anything external, however, until the internal has changed.
I cannot expect to change some negative reaction unless I see internally what lies, what wrong thoughts and feelings are produced within me. Then I may wish to change my inner state, because through inner taste, I dislike what is going on in me. Through an increase in this dislike of my internal life, and so gradually strengthening it through self-observation, by sincerity with myself, my inner state may become strong enough to control my external and mechanical reacting life. This is where a person begins to work on themselves, without showing much external change. I cannot pretend to myself that I alter the reactions of my false personality just like that. But if I observe them in the light of this work, with any sincerity, then I begin to dislike them. Then I begin to struggle with my thoughts and feelings privately. I begin to work on myself and on my inner life. Mechanically, I may take pleasure in disliking some person whom I see visibly in front of me. But after a time, I take no such similar pleasure in thinking how I dislike that person. The reason is because I have begun to be aware of my inner or psychological life, the life of thought and feeling that I have become aware of through self-observation, and which I am trying to arrange in the right manner in the light of this work. When I am in that state of insight, I will continually suffer from myself, from my mechanical reactions. Then I will, in a certain sense, have to endure that external, mechanical reacting person that hitherto I have taken as myself, but which the work has gradually shown me I must separate from. At the time my personality reacts, I will no doubt feel quite justified. But from this deeper and more internal part that is beginning to awaken, I will feel uncomfortable and most certainly take little pleasure in going along with those thoughts or feelings that have been called forth by some momentary irritation. And so gradually, through the growth of something internal, I may sometimes actually feel that something in me is beginning, but only at times, to be stronger than this mechanism that dislikes a person right off. I will no longer be so prone to agree with myself and with the judgments that I make. To be alone with myself and indulge in negative feelings, enjoying unpleasant thoughts about other people, will no longer commend itself to me as a good way to live within me. When I am alone, I will have to review myself as to what has been going on in my centers, and examine myself from the standpoint of what eyes have charge of me in the momentary heat of my mechanical intercourse with life, when I have been completely identified with each passing event, with each typical circumstance. The pleasure of reacting mechanically will no longer give me satisfaction, although it may give great justification to my personality. When I examine myself in this way, when I am alone with myself,
I can only do so rightly when I review the day from the standpoint of all that this work teaches about being identified, about being negative, about making internal accounts, about judging, about lying, about self-justifying, and above all, about remembering to remember oneself.
When I submit myself to the work in the solitary confines of myself in this manner, I will dislike thinking with pleasure of people that I hate. I will not take pleasure in thoughts, although I find it difficult not to take pleasure in disliking the individual when I see them. It has been said that religion consists in what you do in the seclusion of yourself. To get up in the morning after having indulged in all sorts of unpleasant thoughts and feelings about other people is not a good way to start your day. A good many of us know this through inner taste. However, the strengthening of that internal side that wishes to grow, if we have any work eyes in us, depends upon inner sincerity with oneself that the work speaks about so much. If I can never see that I have lied, then I would agree with my personality, my external side, my false personality. And if I justify myself, I cannot have any depth in my observations. Hence, the internal side of me can't possibly grow. In that case, there could never be anything stronger than personality. We cannot, of course, deal with our personality right away, but can begin to suffer from it ourselves privately. We will suffer in the right manner, and only if we observe the reactions of that personality in the light of this work. If we can begin to do that, then we will find it possible to separate from a great many thoughts and feelings that personality takes pleasure in, but which something more deeply placed in us takes no pleasure in at all. To dislike oneself is useless and only gives rise to mental illness and depression. But in this case, to begin to see and dislike the reactions of our personality, to separate from them and so not regard ourselves as being only that, can yield results. Which is why the work emphasizes that we must break ourselves up into different parts and not take anything as a monism, as a unity, which imaginary eye causes us to assume. We cannot change ourselves if we take that as only ourself, and all attempts to do this will lead to a dangerous situation. We have to be able to say to ourselves, I am not this I am not that I. We must be able to say, I am not this thought that comes to me, or I will not take pleasure in thinking or feeling that way. It may only be possible to do this for a short time, and if we can manage that only for a short time, even only from time to time, then gradually something more internal will develop in us that can become able to actually take charge occasionally, then control the reactions of our external, mechanical side. It is easy to think that change is something that takes place finally and irrevocably after a few moments of work, then get upset if we do not observe results. However, that is the wrong concept of what work means. The point lies in how we recover from falling, and it's always interesting to notice how people recover from a bad state, because here lies the work at first, in that learning to walk instead of always falling. Because we are as little children, learning to walk. So if we never fell, then we would never learn. It is on our thoughts, on how we think and feel, that the center of gravity of work falls. And so, if we take pleasure in thoughts as to how we dislike, then it is the same thing as taking pleasure in disliking the object transmitted by our senses. Confronted by some object that you take pleasure in disliking, there may be such a mechanical reaction that you cannot prevent it. However, you can prevent the thoughts afterward as to how you dislike that object. It is here, at this point, that all the work lies. Here lie such thoughts as, can you find anything similar in yourself to what you take such pleasure in disliking in this person? Have you really noticed how you behave? Have you noticed what impressions you give to other people? And so on endlessly. We are trying to build up a psychological internal order of ourselves, arranged through the influences of this work. A delicate organism built up
so to speak, of thoughts and feelings, of right connections, of right associations. A psychological organism that begins to put us in touch with higher centers. A psychological body. When we begin to realize this, we cannot afford to indulge in such things as taking pleasure in thinking how we dislike other people. Why? Because in that case, we are building up a negative psychological organism that will conduct everything in the wrong way, in which there is no truth and nothing good. Many people crystallize out in their negative emotions. Therefore, avoid such people and their influence. The point is to see clearly the difference between a sensation and a thought. You see in front of you a person you do not like because of their clothes, their voice, or their manner, and you take pleasure in disliking that object while looking at it, while your senses transmit their images to you. Afterwards, when you no longer see that person, you take pleasure in thinking about how you dislike them. The Sufi teacher says that the effect on you is the same. The two things are different, one being an object, and the other a thought about the object. Because to see a person who is present and to think about a person who is absent is not the same thing. A different center is being employed. But the dislike in both cases is the same.